speaking of Tarawa, I am going to. I'm playing around with the idea. I don't want to. I don't want to sound like I'm about to do this. It's a discussion I'm going to have with somebody who talked to me about maybe doing some history shows. But one of the things that I'm actually interested in doing a bunch of history shows. Somebody proposed it to me a while ago, and I thought, no, I can't do that. There's just no way. I don't have the time to do the research. And then I realized it's all I do is read military history. And sometimes, you're just not ready for an idea, and then something happens, and you are. And in just this morning in the shower, I realized if I were to do a series of historical, videos on history, I think I would call it. I think I'd call the series "Living Hell," and I think that my take on it would be all war is horrible, but some of them, some situations are beyond description. And I thought I might take a look at these historical examples of things where it's hard to imagine life being worse than that. The first story obviously came to mind was the Taffy 3 story, which I'm not going to repeat here, don't worry. And then I had a couple of others, the Battle of Cannae, where Hannibal and the Carthaginians surrounded two Roman legions, and something like 90,000 men were hacked to death over the course of 8 hours. 90,000 on a very small area, completely surrounded, utterly panicked, and they just simply took about 8 hours to hack away into the center of the Roman formation. The guys became absolutely lethargic. They once they'd been scared enough for long enough, they simply just stood there and just stood there and got hacked to pieces. Other generals have commented on that when you get men under enough stress, they just stand there, which is certainly understandable to me. There's stories from Cannae about guys in the center of the Roman formation. It took 7 hours or something like that from the time that they were surrounded to the time they had to kill 100,000 people with knives and swords. It takes time. And there were stories that people from the inside of the formation, some of these guys, there were a lot of suicides and a lot of people having their friends, do them in. But there were a couple of guys out there who dug a hole in the ground and buried their head in the dirt so that they could kill themselves. They wouldn't have to face this. So Cannae would be one. Taffy 3 would be one. It's tough to pick which World War I battle would be the toughest. Most people would think maybe the first day on the Somme, where 16,000 British soldiers killed in 15 minutes, more or less, walking across this field of flowers. But actually, I don't think that's the most horrific part of the Somme or World War I. And the reason I don't think the first day at the Somme would be what I would pick is because since that battle was basically a surprise attack, they'd softened up the German positions for 5 days, or 7 days or something. But when the British left the trenches, they, honest to God, were walking across fields of grass. They were just walking through tall grass. And then they just started getting cut down, and the artillery came in and started blowing the field up. But you go over the top, you take a bullet, dead is dead, but that's not the horror of World War I. The horror of World War I is that no man's land is so deadly that no one can get to the bodies. In fact, more with the French, I think, than the English, but the French would somewhat frequently do this. They would use the bodies of dead soldiers to build the ramparts of the trenches. And so, you just have to think about that. You would go, Verdun was pretty bad. You'd have these guys walking out into this lunar landscape of shell holes and craters. And then if they got hit and survived, the shell holes were about the only cover they could find. And usually these shell holes are filled with dead soldiers from both sides. And in many cases, dead soldiers who'd been killed 3 weeks earlier or something. The Somme battle went on until November, from July 1st. And the idea, I mean, I don't want to get too terribly graphic with you, but the idea of that is simply, it's unbelievable. They said that parts of these trenches, they would walk over, and it was like walking on a trampoline. It was like walking on a tarp of some kind. That the ground was like mushy and spongy. And it's only later they realized that the reason it was so spongy was because they were walking on top of 60 bodies that had been buried just a couple inches below the soil. Just that World War One trenches is without a doubt, to me, the worst place ever. And the horror of it is, there's always the horror of being surrounded and killed. There's the I don't think anyone's had to endure that kind of artillery. Certainly there was artillery prior to World War One was basically just cannonballs, not terrible. I mean, it's not good if you got hit by one, but nothing like the World War One bombardments. And in World War II, while they had artillery, these bombardments didn't last for 5 days. There's so many stories of these guys just, I mean, it's just unbelievable what they took. And the numbers, you'd have a battalion, I think it was a battalion, 1,000 men go in, and, in one case, 1,000 men went in and 40 of them answered the roll call when it was over. You would think that the officers might be safer, but they took a much higher percentage killed because it was the officers that got up and said, "Follow me, boys." Most of them were second lieutenants, 18, 19, 20 years old, subalterns they called them in the British Army. And they were the best people that Britain ever produced. They were the most educated, most decent, just clean, good Edwardian kids. And they went there to do their duty, and they got put into this living hell. Not just the shells, and not just the machine guns, not just watching 9 out of 10 people go down. People would be left out on the battlefield, and they're wounded, and they're dying of thirst, and they're bleeding out, and they couldn't get them in the daytime, and at nighttime they couldn't get very far because they had stretcher bearers who had to go out. They said sometimes it would take 6 men to get 1 man out of there. And one guy, after the first day on the Somme, came back alive. They found him alive after 8 days. 8 days. No food, no water. He got water off of dead bodies that he was able to crawl to. I don't know what the numbers are, but there are. It's unbelievable how many people were killed in that war by lack of medical care. In other words, significant numbers. Many, many people who died would have survived if they could have gotten to them, but they simply couldn't. They just had to leave them out there. But the idea of a landscape that's just filled with nothing but decomposing bodies, and having bodies built into the walls of your trench, and I was reading a story about guys who are famous, including J.R.R. Tolkien and Basil Rathbone, C.S. Lewis. All these guys were in the front, and one of them said he was scrambling to get back into his own trench, and when he got back, all the guys there said, "Man, you smell really horrible." And you got to understand that this smell of death is everywhere, all the time, everywhere. They said, "You smell terrible," and and he looked down and he found out that his boot was covered in muck. He'd stepped on somebody and stepped on some decomposing corpse, and his boot's just covered by this stuff. He just, pulls it off and heaves it over the side with a bayonet. Edward Smith says, we owe a lot of modern plastic surgery to World War I. That's absolutely true. And one of the reasons that that happened was that because so many people died from artillery, I think by far the majority of the guys were killed by artillery. A bullet enters you and it makes a big hole, but it's a relatively clean hole. I mean, you know what a bullet looks like, and it's going through the air and it's spiraling and goes through you and makes a hole and tumbles sometimes. Causes a lot of shock damage to the tissue around it. But what we're talking about are shells exploding, and we're talking about jagged pieces of iron, this big. And these things would just take off like the entire lower jaw of a guy. Everything from here down gone. And he would survive. I used to watch Boardwalk Empire, which was not a bad show. Not great, but not bad. And one of the lead characters there was a former World War I guy who wore a mask because some of these guys had half of their heads blown off. And they would wear like partial masks to just to cover the wounds so that people didn't faint on the streets, Yeah, and Aesop points out that they were walking so slowly. That's what they did on the first day on the Somme. They just, all these British soldiers got up and they put the rifles at high port because they didn't want to have the bayonets forward to stick their own guys. So they're walking with their rifles up here like this. And they're walking across this grass field, and then all of a sudden the machine guns open up and down they go. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So I think that'd be an interesting series only because I can't get enough of it. I don't know why. My wife knows something about it, maybe more about it than I do. I really interested in what the limit of human endurance is. And Cody MacArthur-Fett points out just how malnourished these British soldiers were. I mean, if you saw them today, you'd think they'd belong in a hospital. This is before they got into uniform. They're just stooped and not to push this cliche, but if you look at the "They Shall Not Grow Old" that we talked about before, that World War I recreation documentary by Peter Jackson. I mean, you look at these 18, 19-year-old kids, and some of them don't have any teeth. Some of them have 3 or 4 teeth. Some of them have teeth that just everywhere, and and they're malnourished, and it's just unbelievable, unbelievable. Actually, the thing I thought was interesting about World War I never really thought of it this way, but I read a pretty compelling argument that said that everybody says that World War I was a catastrophe because you had modern weapons like machine guns and high explosives and old-fashioned tactics. And that seems self-obvious to me. But somebody pointed out that the real problem with World War I and the reason it was so horrific in terms of casualties was because the communications weren't good enough. In other words, you had a battlefield at Waterloo. Wellington could get on a horse and ride from one side of the battlefield to the other in 5 or 10 minutes. Now you've got these battlefields that are 20 miles long. Nobody's in direct observation of the entire battle. And so if you're going to launch this offensive, you can't communicate, which means you can't control it. So they thought that they would do the whole thing like a giant... would I like a red camera? I would very much. They did the whole thing like a giant clockwork toy. In other words, they go over the top at 7:30. At 7:35, they'll be at this objective. The artillery barrage will then move forward, and then they'll advance another 100 yards, and then they'll take this, and then back and forth like it was. I mean, you look back on it. This is exactly what I'm writing about in this firewall, by the way. I'm talking about the human landscape and talking about just the flexibility and the fluidity of our U.S. military and how unheard of it is. Unheard of. to think and train this way. It's exactly what I've been writing about. But the idea that you could just wind up this plan, and as long as the plan was detailed enough, then you just send off the plan. No. So they had telephone communications, but the telephone wires were almost always cut by artillery. Passenger pigeons are obviously not very reliable and difficult to carry into combat and so on. Homing pigeons, all various kinds of signaling. And they said that the real tragedy of World War I was that you already had mechanized warfare, but they didn't have the radio yet. Radio was in existence, but portable radios, even something that they could put on the line, the technology just wasn't there. They say that it often would take 8 hours for a report to go from the front to headquarters and then back and give orders. 8 hours. And so, the classic example in the case of the first day on the Somme was they went over the top at 7:30 and the artillery barrage ended at 7:25 or 27 or something, but it left 3 minutes or 5, something like that, when it was just, okay, the Germans had been in their dugouts. Everybody thought they'd all been killed. No, they're 30, 40, 50 feet deep. And then the artillery stops, and that gave them just enough time to get up and get to their machine guns. And down go the British. If you'd had communications, you'd do what you would do in World War II and beyond up until today. You'd have some guys that are doing well, some guys that are behind. The guys who are getting behind would radio in some coordinates, and then the artillery would hit where they were going, and so on. But they couldn't communicate. And the generals were, I don't know. Some people say they've been unfairly treated. I think that's probably true, but it's just this idea that you could send these waves and waves and waves of people and lose 16,000 killed in 15 minutes and still think like, okay, this is going okay. Now I just have to attack harder. Steve Darrow says, wonder how much of the latitude that was given to the NCOs in Normandy was as a result of the realization that battlefield comms are crap. They were crap in World War II, but they didn't exist at all in World War I. Now they're pretty much superb. Nowadays, if we have guys out in the field and they're getting shot at from a building, we don't have to send them running across the open spaces, and lose 15 guys to take out a sniper in a building. Now they keep their head down. They get on the radio. They call in coordinates. I'm not saying they don't storm buildings. Don't get me wrong. And 10 or 15 minutes later or sooner, a jet appears or a predator appears, usually a jet, and a couple 500-pound bombs go down through the window, and that's the end of that problem. So anyway, this idea of living hell is something I'd really be interested in, because some of the stories from history are just, you can see how people could survive just from a sheer, you send 60,000 guys into battle, you're going to have 10 really amazing stories of survival, and most of the people are killed. But some of the stuff is, you can understand how they survived the battle, but you don't, you can't understand how they could ever live a day after what they'd been through. TAPS 558 says the Army is pushing decentralized command. That is precisely what this firewall is about. Is all about multi-domain engagements, and how I heard a 3-star general in the Army say that we train so that we will flourish in chaos, not survive chaos, not manage chaos, flourish in chaos. Thrive is the word he used, rather. Thrive. We're going to thrive in chaos. That is the antithesis of this big battle plan, and that's why I'm feeling very, very good about this U.S. military, because the Chinese can copy technology. Chinese as example. They can copy the technology, they can copy all of this stuff, but what they cannot copy is they cannot copy the relationship between between the command structure and the guys in the field, especially the low-level officers or NCOs. There's nobody else that can do that culturally. Natasha talks about how in Russia, guys would mandatory, service for 2 years. This is going on today. These nice Russian kids would go to the Russian army and they'd be hazed so badly that they just kind of turn into, monsters. And we don't do that. One example I use in this firewall that I just wrote is I got a chance to go on the Spruance Aegis class destroyer a year ago or so, and a 3-star admiral who was a vice admiral who was in command of, I think he was commander of Pacific Surface Fleet Pacific, which means that everything that floats in the Pacific Ocean he owned. Before we went out to the destroyer, we went around all of the bay, naval base down at San Diego's enormous, and we're putting around in this very nice little wooden boat, which was the admiral's launch. And since he's a 3-star, we would pass outgoing destroyers, and we passed one of those New York class transports. It's just enormous ships, just huge. And we're this tiny little boat with 3 stars on the flag, and everybody who was on the deck on those ships on the way out had to come to the rail and stand at attention until the admiral passed. So this guy is a pretty big guy. But as I say in this firewall, the thing that was the most impressive to me was not that he was spending an hour with Yo-Yo like me, but that he, when he got out of his car and walked down the ramp at the pier where his launch was tied up, there were these 2 African American women who were stewards, enlisted naval people, and they're if you're E1 in the Navy and you're a steward, you're probably pretty near the bottom of the pyramid as far as prestige and glamour and all the rest of it goes. And this 3-star admiral, before he came over and talked to us, he went over and returned their salutes and shook their hands and asked them how they were doing, called them by their first name, remembered things that he said from when he talked to them before, made sure that there was nothing that they needed, or that, let him know if there was anything, that they could see improve. This is, the idea of that happening in China is inconceivable. It's inconceivable that a Chinese admiral would have that kind of conversation with a couple of stewards. It's inconceivable. It's inconceivable in the Imperial Japanese Navy as well. It's not inconceivable in the American Navy. And it's the same for everything. I'm going to show a couple of these marshalling videos just very briefly. But you've got a guy who's probably a sergeant, I guess. Maybe he's an airman. You got a guy out there with a couple of batons, and he's marshalling jets out of the line. And basically, what he's doing is he's just getting them clear of their park location and getting them out on the taxiway. And you see these guys just they're doing the King Tut dance, and sometimes they're dressed like Wonder Woman, or they got a rabbit hat on, and they're goofing, and they're goofing, and this is the part that I find most fascinating about this, is you'll see these guys going by, and they're doing all these dances, and they're doing all this stuff, and the pilots are up there. You can see them laughing, and just as these guys pass them, just the instant before when the marshal is about to release them to the taxiway, it's like a split second, actually, just before they let them go, these guys come to like perfect attention. They throw off this perfectly crisp salute. The pilots, give them a salute back and give them maybe, their squadron hand signs or something. And it's like this guy in the plane is a captain or a major or maybe even a lieutenant colonel or something. And these guys are 18, 19-year-old enlisted men, and they are goofing with each other. They're joking. They're having fun. And not only do the officers in those jets, not only do they not go, this is terrible, we have American soldiers, they're just loving it. And that, to me, is what morale is. You look at a deck on a carrier, a Chinese carrier, and you'll see people doing the same jobs as on an American carrier, and everything's very clean and very new, but their jets are crap, and they've got 4 or 5 guys, and they're doing everything that you see on the American decks, and I refuse to believe that they just didn't copy it outright, because they got all the same, they've got the same color-coded outfits, the launch signals are the same, the shooter's the same, all of this stuff. And they're so serious, and everything is, very quiet. And there's a great thing out there called Gagnon Shooter. I can't recommend it highly enough. I think it's guys from the Eisenhower, I want to say. And they're playing Gagnon style. This video was made several years ago when that was big, 2013, somewhere around there, 12, 13, 14. And these guys are dancing to Gagnon style. They're doing the Gagnon style dance. And they're just they're just doing this dance, and they're telling these guys run the engines up, and they're goofing, and just like with the Air Force marshaling, they're just having a blast. And then there's that instant when they simply stop, and then there's like boom, boom. They're just pointing to the 5 or 6 stations that they need to get a thumbs up on, and then these guys go down into the shooter position, and off they go. And I realized that this kind of fooling around isn't fooling around, because if you watch them fooling around, you will see, and this is the part that interests me the most, you will see an instant where suddenly they're not fooling around. It's not like they are fooling around the whole time. They're like fooling around, and then just as they're ready to let go of those jets, they just snap to attention, and you can tell these guys are just absolutely on the ball. And my entire point here, I think, is that if you can be that loose and have that much fun, that comes from the kind of confidence that is only bred by experience. You can't have a Navy, with guys launching, multi-million-dollar jets, pretending to snap footballs, and dancing Gangnam style. And you can't have them do that unless they know what they're doing. And they absolutely know what they're doing. And you can't replace that. You can't do it. And it's not a question of technology. Hey, how are you? We're good, thanks. Have a good night. I know you're going to have to get this guy on for sure. You can replace the technology. You can replace the hardware. You can copy the hardware. You can do all of that. And you can even make an attempt to follow the procedures, but you can't culturally crack that nut. You can't do it. There's something about the egalitarianism of American culture, this lack of this rebellion against any kind of nobility or class distinctions, or you're in the military, you are subordinate to your superior officers, and that's one thing, but just the independence of it and the freedom of it just fascinates me, and I can't imagine it anywhere else. I can't even imagine it in the British Navy, for example. I've seen some pictures of some marshalers from Britain who are having fun, but I can't imagine it in the Royal Navy. But even in any event, the great story about this is that when I was on the Spruance, I was talking with the exec, and he said that China's building anywhere from 4 to 6 destroyers for every one of our Arleigh Burkes that we let go, that we can launch. They're building 4 or 5 or 6 of a Type 40, I want to say. Apparently, it's a fairly capable ship, and they're just mass outproducing us. And this would be worrisome, and it is worrisome on some level. But he said that every now and then they would do this kind of a courtesy thing where some of their officers would come aboard U.S. ship, and then they would go aboard the Chinese ship. And he said when the Chinese came aboard the Spruance, first of all, they were on a little guided tour, and several members of the Chinese officer delegation had accidentally somehow managed to wander off of the tour and find themselves, being stopped outside the torpedo room or the CIC or whatever. So there's that whole cheating kind of thing, which just is annoying. But the main point of this is the exec was telling me they were asking questions about operations and stuff, and the exec was telling them about damage control. And in the Navy, our Navy, everybody is a damage control specialist. Everybody trains for damage control. The cooks put out fires. The helicopter pilots know how to put out fires. The mechanics know how to put out fires. They all know how to do it. And the reason they know how to do it is because we had a hard lesson in World War II. We had damage control teams, and then there'd be damage to the ship, and the damage control team would be killed. Or the damage control team can't get to where it needs to go because of the damage. And because of that, the Navy just decided, and I'm sure it's true for the other services as well, we're just going to, whatever we hire you to do as a specialist, you're going to be a cook or a, whatever. Or you're going to be the missile officer. It doesn't matter. All of you are going to get trained on how to put out fires, how to stop flooding, all of this. Because the ship then it's an organic living thing where everybody depends on everybody else. And they went to the trouble to explain this to the Chinese, and the Chinese couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. They simply could not culturally do it. They could not accept the fact that every single individual there was capable of doing these things. So they've got damage control team, and we have a damage control ship. And if it turns out we ever get a chance to test these two theories, I have no doubt whatsoever about how that will come out. I might as well give the whole thing away. Begin this thing by talking about the fact that we just bought 80 F-15s, F-15X with some stealth added on there, so it's a 4.5 generation fighter. And I pointed out that the F-15 was first flew, I want to say, it's 40 years old. 40 years old. That's a little long in the tooth for a fighter jet. Wait a minute, the F-15 might be 50. It's the M1 that maybe is 40, something like that. So we're sending our guys into tanks that their grandfathers did. So the F-15 is an old airframe, and you would think that. I came up with an expression I liked a lot for this afterburner. I remember a firewall rather. I remember thinking, the surest way to get your ass kicked is to appear weak. And the second surest way to get your ass kicked is to believe that you cannot get your ass kicked. And I thought, wow, are we overconfident? We've got all this old gear. Are we resting on our laurels? Are we preparing to fight the last war? Are we making these same mistakes that every other military in history has always made? Always. You're successful, you win a war, and that is the strategy that you use to go ahead and lose the next war. We're not doing that. We're not doing anything like that. And the mental flexibility of the command structure, and I'm talking about the chairman, I'm talking about the Joint Chiefs now. The mental flexibility. We're going to teach people to thrive in chaos. We're going to empower everybody. We're going to cross-train everybody. There's no other military in the world that can do that because they just don't have the culture. This just doesn't exist. It's simply built into America. And as Foghorn's pointed out many times to me, we no longer really go to war. It's like the Navy goes to war, the Air Force goes to war. The Chinese currently, their sea forces are called the People's Liberation Army Navy. And the rivalry between the Army and the Navy in China right now, as always, is enormous. In World War II, Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army fought each other more than they fought us. There were many cases in World War II, where the Japanese were launching some kind of an invasion or something, and the Army didn't even know about it. They didn't talk to each other. They hated each other. So now, and this is not unique, and we've suffered from this a little bit ourselves. And in fact, maybe not a little bit, maybe quite a bit, but we learned some lessons. And as Foghorn and others were telling me, we don't go to war like anybody else anymore. It's not like this is an Air Force mission or a Navy mission or whatever. It's just we go in with assets, and we put them together in any way we want to. And everybody's talking to everybody else, and everybody is nobody's guarding their turf. I'm sure that happens in you know, in the appropriations, and you know, and when you're buying things and stuff, but in the field, no. So you could have a Marine with a laser target designator painting a target, and that Marine's painting a target is picked up by an Air Force drone, and then it's relayed by a Space Force satellite, presumably coming Space Force, and then beamed down to a Navy destroyer, and they launch a cruise missile, and boom. It's all the same force. It's all the same sensor net. So the reason we're buying these F-15s is not because we're bringing a fourth generation fighter into fifth generation combat. We're buying the F-15s because it's a big, strong-ass airplane, and it is going to simply carry bombs and missiles into the sky. And the F-22s and the F-35s, which I had very seriously maligned, and I still think that the procurement side of that was terrible. But with that said, I really jumped the gun on that. When I heard that it couldn't outfight the F-16, I thought, my God, we're making these same mistakes all over again. We're gold plating this thing, and it can't turn. We're assuming it's never going to get in a dogfight. Well, I was wrong about that. One of the reasons that it was that the F-16 beat it was that its software was limiting the jet. It was like all fly-by-wire. It was literally limiting the jet. But the main thing was that the pilots hadn't figured out how to fly this thing yet. The F-35 has so many capabilities that we simply didn't have the tactics, and we're still learning the tactics. But you know, there were many stories of you know, the F-15 is the undisputed champion of air-to-air combat. It's last I checked, its record was 172 wins against 0 losses, and the F-15s can't find these things. You can send up 8 F-15s against 2 F-22s, and the F-15s just disappear. They never see them. So I've heard that many as 16 F-15s up against 2 F-22s, and I read earlier today that there's a case of these F-15 guys, and they just, last thing they know is their radars, they're being locked on, and the simulated missile hit. And the first time that these guys in the F-15 ever saw any indication that there was an F-22 there was when the F-22 pilot went shooting over their canopy 15 feet above them from behind. You know, so this is actually brilliant. Why would you spend the money for an F-35 if all that aircraft is going to do is lift ordnance into the sky? Bring back the F-16s, the F-15s, keep them. They're amazing airplanes, absolutely astonishing. And the F-16 as my friend Foghorn says, that airplane is not the same aircraft as the one that came off the line in the 70s. It's a completely different aircraft. You can't even really call it the same thing. The software has been upgraded so much. Avionics have been upgraded. All the weapons delivery system. We've got you know, the Sidewinder AIM-9er-X Ray is every single thing you know about dogfighting and everything you've ever seen ever in any movie about dogfighting ever has been about one guy trying to get the tail of the other guy and shoot him down with machine gun bullets, or in the more recent era, get into that kind of defensive, that kind of cone behind him so that you can get a missile shot off or a heat-seeking missile off. And the F-35 and the AIM-9er X-ray is, you don't have to be behind the guy. You see him? Yeah, okay. Shoot. Thing comes off the rail, turns around, and blows the guy up. So nobody else is doing this. And I did this whole thing because I was so tired of hearing about the Chinese this and, you know, the new Chinese fighters and the J-20 and all this is all junk. They're garbage. Their engines are crap. Their carrier is a jump ramp carrier, which means that those jets can barely get off the carrier. They can't carry any ordnance. And it looks like the Navy, and they try to make it sound like the Navy and all that, but it's not. And the same thing is for their Air Force. I don't buy any of it. Anyway, that's my little rant about that. But in any event, I am not the slightest bit worried about this. And for the foreseeable future, I'm not worried about it. I cannot believe the attitude that comes from high-level American officers. I don't know whether that's because some of them might have been, although it's getting a little late for this. In fact, it probably is too late for this. I don't guess many of these guys were actually in Vietnam, but we learned a lot of lessons from Vietnam. And the one word I think that's most astonishing to me, having spoken to this admiral and listened to a couple of 3-star generals, is humility. The humility that they have. I mean, think about that. Just the raw, just that's the magic key. It's the humility. It's not this, we're going to fight the last war. We're going to fight the next war the way we fought the last war. No, we don't know what's going to happen. And just flexibility and humility is amazing. Absolutely amazing. Oh, yeah, Foghorn says they were the current upper level command is not from Vietnam, but the Vietnam guys were their teachers. It's a good point. So, that's the best thing that can happen to a country is get a bloody nose early. So, anyway.